Hello, and welcome to AntKast by Ant Group. This is a podcast that brings you deep into conversations with global thinkers, innovators, and entrepreneurs on groundbreaking technology and how they're shaping our lives for better or for worse. I'm your host, Chenny Zhu from Ant Group. We believe that technology can make our world green, sustainable, and more inclusive as long as we use it in the right way. Our episode today is on the future of algorithms, and we're honored to have two award-winning science fiction writers, Ken Liu and Stanley Chen, as our guests today to talk about the current and future trends of algorithms from their unique perspectives. Welcome to AntKast, Ken.
Thanks for having me, Chenny.
Welcome, Stan.
With pleasure.
Both of you are well-known science fiction writers, and coincidentally, both of you have also worked at tech companies before. So in your eyes, what is the relationship between the technology innovations in our world today and the ones found in science fiction? What are you exploring in your science fiction?
So I don't really view sci-fi as a predictive enterprise. I think sometimes some commentators talk about sci-fi as though it's about predicting the future. I don't view it that way. I don't think sci-fi ever successfully predicts anything, and I don't think that's what most sci-fi writers are interested in doing. Maybe some are. I certainly am not. I think the way I think about sci-fi is very much about telling the story of technology. And technology is defined very broadly as any kind of manifestation of the human mind in the physical world. And sci-fi is very good at trying to tell stories about technology based on the moment that the writer and the reader are in. So when you write sci-fi, you're obviously writing from the moment. But when you're reading sci-fi, you're also reading from the moment. So that's why when we read classical SF, we get something very different out of them every generation. And it's that interaction, that kind of reaction between the story being told in the fiction and the story that you're actually living through. It's that interaction that allows you to see reality in a new way.
So to me, science fiction is a narrative. It's a artistic form of using technology as one of the elements to explore and express the relationship between technology and humans. So I think it just like mirrors. Science fiction is kind of the mirror reflecting the reality together, like all these kind of elements like humanity, technology, society, geopolitics. But the mirror is not necessary to be flat. It might have some twisted, it might have some kind of like blow up effects. It's quite interesting to seeking for the relationship of technology within science fiction, but meanwhile you got a lot of fun. I think that's the most important part for me. I think for most of the audience as well.
So in your minds, what are the positive things that algorithms have brought into our lives?
Well, for me, one of the great positive effects of an algorithmic approach to modern life is simply making me feel more connected with all of humanity. I think the fact that we now have the ability to see connections between previously completely disparate spheres as a result of algorithms making recommendations and connecting us to things we never would have seen otherwise. I get recommended TV shows by Netflix all the time that I never would have found out or discovered on my own. I get recommended music that I never would have sought out myself. I get recommended books that I wouldn't have known about. I think that's really wonderful. The fact that I feel more connected and see stuff that I otherwise wouldn't have seen, and I feel good about that.
Yeah, I start to go online surfing since I think it was like 16 or 17. So I think the biggest change in a good way brought to me by algorithm is social media. So, but it was back in the day when the social media is not as trolling as nowadays. So I think back in the day, because I was born and raised in a very small city, like only a 1 million population, but everyone knows everyone. So you didn't get a chance to know a lot of diverse people, especially I'm the fan of science fiction, but the people around me, actually, there's no one has interest in science fiction at all. So that make me feels very lonely. So after a while, when I get in touch with internet, so there's a huge like community online, so there's people living all around the country or even the world. They are totally fascinating about science fiction and movies. That make me feel like I'm not lonely anymore, and if you totally, as Ken mentioned, you're connected into a greater existence, which is feel like a belonging and beloved. So I think that's the best thing ever happened on me, brought by algorithm.
So, both of your books address how algorithms affect society, for example, in inheriting human biases, which has been a big topic lately. Can you both share where your ideas for this came from and in what ways they have become a concern for you? I'll start with Ken this time.
A lot of my concern about algorithms comes from the fact that we now hide a lot of things behind the idea of algorithms. So, for example, a lot of companies claim that they have automatic processes for identifying offensive images or content, or they claim that they have algorithms for detecting things that are supposedly in violation of terms of use or laws. When you dig into it a little bit, you realize that oftentimes there is no machine behind it. It's actually humans doing the work. They hire workers to do this, and they claim that there's some sort of algorithm. I have become much more concerned over time with the idea that algorithm is now being used as a way to shield those truly responsible from the consequences of their actions. It becomes a way to not take responsibility for your decisions. It becomes a way to force those not in power to take on work that they really shouldn't be doing. And it becomes a way in general for us to claim a kind of neutral, objective decision-making process that does not in fact exist. So those are the things I'm mostly concerned with. Not so much the idea of algorithms somehow making us less human. That's a very different kind of concern, and I want to talk about that later, but it's not my primary concern.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Stan, what are your views on this?
So to me, I think right now, it seems to me like the word algorithm is being generalized in many different domains, like in economy, in sociology, anthropology, psychology, literature, arts. So like even like psychotherapy. So you can see all this kind of terms of like using algorithm. For example, I had a book entitled "The Algorithm for Life," was published 2019. But in that year, there were three books share the same titles, but all tapping different domains. So I think that's what interests me the most, because it means like we create some kind of consensus, like we can equally compare human with some kind of program.
I want to pick up on what Stan just said,
Yep.
This whole idea of algorithm as a kind of magic. I want to talk about two examples, and I want to talk about how we see things as algorithms or talk about them as algorithms when in fact other things are just as algorithmic, but we don't talk about them that way. So, for example, I'm very deeply concerned with the whole idea of algorithms trying to make humans behave more like machines. That's probably one of the things that I care about the most. And to take another example, in the US, for the longest time, the way we determine individuals' prison sentences was through a very, very detailed checklist of factors. Whatever the defendant did, what the defendant didn't do. Did the defendant have prior convictions? Did the defendant have a firearm, etc., etc.? You tick down these elements, and out of the process, a sentence is the result. We didn't talk about the sentencing guidelines as an algorithm, but that's essentially what it is. The purpose of all of these algorithms really is to just take the responsibility for making decisions away from individuals, to give it the patina of objectivity. But the reality is, this is nothing more than a way to make every individual in the system behave less like a human, less like an individual person, and more like a component of a machine. It's that overall tendency to turn humans into machines via algorithms that I find deeply fascinating, disturbing, and is a focus of a lot of my sci-fi.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, from what you're talking about and what Stan just mentioned, it sounds like sort of a dark magical realism lens that we're looking at algorithms through. And we'll discuss later what you think can be done, both from society's perspective and an individual user's point of view on this. But in the meantime, I wanted to get into Stan's example that he raised earlier in his latest book, AI 2041, which consists of 10 sci-fi short stories and the societal impacts of the themes discussed. You also address the pros and cons of algorithms, and in those envisioning different near-future scenarios, both the obvious benefits and also the existential perils and on inequality, etc. So, Stan, could you share some more of your thoughts from that book and give a few examples on how algorithms, however we define it, interact with society?
Right. So there are 10 stories in the book AI 2041, all set in 10 different countries, 10 different cities, so all tap in different areas related to AI technology. So for example, there are a lot of like you say, pros and cons on algorithm. For example, there's one story set in Mumbai, India. It's about how people using AI to smartly manipulate the insurance fee. But meanwhile, it just like what Ken just mentioned, there's so many interesting mechanisms behind the scene. So people actually don't know what their behavior might change, the dynamic, the fluctuation of the fee. So they try a lot of different things, like change their habits, change their route while driving, change their dietary, and maybe change their social interaction. It's within their language, within their social class, within their consumerism behavior, and within all this kind of different level of behavior and interactions. So the algorithm actually dig out all this kind of bias and discrimination and amplify all this kind of inequality. So AI is not supposed to, for all those only AI superpower countries, or for those elite, for those privileged class, but supposed to build for everyone. So that's the point I hold on to in AI 2041.
Yeah, I think, Stan really just ticked off a lot of issues that I also am deeply concerned with our obsession with algorithms. I think this whole idea of algorithms being a neutral, objective way to make decisions is deeply flawed, because when we talk about algorithms now, it's a marketing buzzword, but a lot of times what we're really talking about is not so much algorithms, but machine learning, especially pattern data mining, patterns that are mined from the data. And Stan's point, one of the points that Stan made largely is that when you derive patterns from data and you use those patterns to make predictions, you're essentially making two assumptions that are deeply flawed. One is that the data is invariable. That is, the past will always reliably predict the future. So, for example, let's talk about something near and dear to Stan and me. Let's talk about the book selling market. If you apply algorithms to sales data, you can say, okay, books like this and this are very successful. So in the future, books with these elements will always be successful. That's what a lot of folks who are working in entertainment try to do. They say, let's analyze all the scripts and all the box office receipts from the past 100 years. And we now know what makes a movie successful. In the future, we will just make movies with these elements and will always be successful. And this is not, some sort of sci-fi dystopian. This is what a lot of people do. Authors obsess with sales data and what in the past have succeeded, and they try to imitate that. And the idea that if you just do what used to work, you will succeed in the future is an assumption behind this sort of data-driven approach. But I'm not sure. I think there's very little evidence that that approach actually works, especially in industries where trying to do something new, trying to be innovative is actually the key. So that's one part of it. The other assumption is that the data is neutral, inclusive, and in fact, applicable for everybody. But we all know that is not true. This is not just a matter of modern algorithm. It's a deep issue with a lot of contemporary scientific research too. A lot of social science, psychology, psychological research have been debunked, essentially because they were derived from data on a small set of essentially undergrads from Western countries, and their behavior is now described as somehow universal, and we're now just realizing how flawed that approach is. Your data is deeply flawed. But when we do data mining to make predictions and to create algorithms that's supposed to work for everybody, obviously, this is an issue. And even trying to correct for these errors leads to terrible problems. So, for instance, some companies may realize that their facial recognition algorithms are not properly trained because they were trained primarily on one set of people with certain demographics, and they don't apply to folks who are underrepresented in the sample they used. So rather than actually trying to figure out a better way of solving this problem, they use computers to synthesize fake facial images to try to train their algorithms to be more inclusive. This is sort of like the cure is worse than the disease. And I think that's the sort of thing that we have to really keep an eye out for and look into it. It's a complicated issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like opening a Pandora's box of addressing these inherent human biases. But before we turn too dark, so Ken, your Dandelion Dynasty quartet is set in a fantasy world in which the heroes are engineers, not magicians. So here the heroes are engineers instead of people with superpowers. So from this use of character, are you actually an optimist about the future of technology?
I'm not an optimist about technology per se, because I don't think technology is something to be optimistic or pessimistic about. So I've always loved engineering, and I think engineering is a deeply human enterprise. And I think technology is and engineering. The engineering is really a language on its own. It's a way for us to put our minds into the world. It's a way to realize mental structures in the physical world itself. So it's one of the most human and fantastic things that we do. But technology itself has no moral compass either way. It just amplifies human tendencies. So technology can allow us to amplify the worst parts of ourselves, but also can amplify the best parts of ourselves. It really isn't actually, it doesn't have its inherent moral quality. What I sort of want to focus on is, because technology just amplifies our own tendencies and our own powers, we have to think hard about what is the story we want to tell about ourselves? What kind of humans do we want to be? If we cannot resist being the worst parts of ourselves, blaming it on technology is kind of, an easy way out. It's sort of like saying, I'm not doing anything bad. It's the algorithm. This is the typical thing. The CEO saying, oh, we didn't do anything. We just relied on the algorithm. For humans to say, gosh, this is the unintended consequences of technological development. I feel it's the same sort of thing. It's just shirking responsibility. Technology itself has no moral compass whatsoever. It has the potential to amplify the best things we do. It can lead to equality, justice, all the things we want. And if it doesn't, the flaw is not within the technology. It's with us, because we did not tell the story correctly. We did not tell the story we wanted to tell.
Yeah, so let's just keep going on the storytelling element. And I really liked what you said, Ken, about what kind of humans do we want to be. So your story, The Algorithms for Love, focuses on a woman in the near future who programs interactive AI dolls. Are you worried that one day we will lose our humanity in these types of AI explorations? And can you talk about that, about reaching the singularity and all of that?
Yeah, I don't. I don't think I'm worried about us losing our humanity. What does it mean to be human? Really, that definition changes over time. In the time of Plato, he worried about the fact that we were going to lose our humanity due to the rise of a new technology, and he was very concerned that the technology would cause us to mistake rote learning for wisdom, and to think that we know something when we don't, to put our trust into machines, or equivalent of machines rather than human reason. And the technology he was railing against was writing. He thought writing was a terrible technology because it made you less human. You were no longer going to live in your memories. You were going to trust empty, dead words, dead marks on the page. How can that possibly be the same thing as actual rhetoric, debate, the flowing of living words? We, of course, now don't think the way he did. By Plato's definition, we're all less human now as a result of our reliance on writing. So obviously, what is human changes over time. I would argue that writing has made us, in fact, both more and less human. And it's inevitable. Without technology, algorithms will be the same.
Right. So I think more importantly is to realize what is incapable of machine actually is the strength of human beings, like compassion, like creativity, and also like something maybe only human can do is like crafting some kind of artistic work with our bare hands, with our bare eyes, which is like far away from what a machine can do. So I think those parts are what we should teach and encourage our children to learn and to practice, not just behave and practice, or doing this kind of competition, like what machine can do way better than us. So I think that's the huge blind spots in our system, and I think it's driving everyone insane, and it's driving us towards the cliff of the civilization.
Yeah, I think Stan has already touched on the kind of solutions aspect. Let's move into kind of solutions, as you both do imagine realities in science fiction realism. So, in the past few years, there's been a lot of debate on big tech algorithms and how they're affecting our lives. Whistleblowers have called out how social media platforms' algorithms are capturing more teenage user screen time, which may have detrimental psychological and socioeconomic implications. And algorithms for ads, for example, on social media are also iterating, getting smarter every day, which are leading to excess consumption, etc. So what do you think in our current world should be done, both from society's perspective, technology, and individual users' point of view, so that our society doesn't become this kind of dark science fiction that we were just talking about?
I don't think there are easy solutions. I think oftentimes when we talk about problems like this, we think that there's some magical bullet that you can use to solve the problem once and for all. Often people talk about regulation or something like that, the idea that somehow you can just magically declare the problem solved and it will be solved. I don't think it's anything like that. I think it's a dynamic issue. I think it's going to be require constant debate and struggle. But I do think there are two themes that can make things better. One is the idea of transparency. I think we need to demystify algorithms and data-driven approaches. Oftentimes, when you question a decision, you're told that it's just what the data says. You can't argue with it. The data is the data. Well, actually, you can. I mean, as we've seen, whenever you actually dig into these data-driven algorithms, you find all sorts of ridiculous flaws. So I would like there to be more transparency, both in the sorts of data that are collected and also the kinds of data that go into decision making, and more clear understanding from everyone as to what it means to have an algorithm being optimized. Oftentimes the argument is, well, if you disclose the algorithm, then people will just optimize for it. Well, people are already doing that. They're just doing it blindly by guessing. How is that any worse than if people knew exactly what it is you were doing and optimize for that, and you just have to keep on adapting? I think that's really the only way. So
Right.
I want transparency and disclosure. The other thing I think will matter is localization, meaning local control. Rather than encouraging unlimited growth and globalize everything, there can be more local control, local differentiation, and to have more types of problem-solving approaches that are uniquely suited to every community. I think true diversity at the local level will be a counter to the unlimited growth and all the problems that come from misguided efforts to globalize everything.
Very clear solutions you've brought up, Ken and Stan. And before we wrap up here, are there any other exciting new projects that you can share with us?
I'm pretty excited right now because there's a couple of projects I'm working on that I think are interesting. I can't talk about all of them, but I will mention that one is AMC is turning a series of my stories from The Hidden Girl and Other Stories, the collection, into a TV show called Pantheon. And it's an animation show aimed at adults. Drama, in fact. And that's very rare in American TV. So I'm very excited to see the result. And that's supposed to come out next year.
Currently, AI 2041 just got published in English market, and it will be translated into a dozen of other language next year. So right now I'm just finished a relatively shorter novel for kids. It's about like carbon neutrality. So I do a lot of research and asking a lot of experts in the domain. So it's a super complex concept across different disciplinaries. So I think it's kind of impossible to explain it clearly enough even to an adult, but to a kid. So there's a lot of challenges there, but you'll soon be finished.
That's super exciting, Stan. Awesome.
Awesome. That sounds very exciting. Thanks for sharing that with us, Ken and Stan. Let's get into recommendations. Ken, do you have a novel or another art form that you're excited to share with our audience?
Yeah, I do. I've been really deeply touched by this book by Lulu Miller called Why Fish Don't Exist. It's a difficult book to describe because it's in part autobiography, in part biography, in part history of science, in part philosophy. But I like books like that are very hard to classify and difficult to put into a box. But essentially, Miller goes into how she confronts an existential crisis about what it means to live in a universe that is essentially random, chaotic. How do you find the courage to go on as a human being? It's connected to, in some ways to what we're talking about today, because algorithms are the modern answer to how do we go on. But Miller tries to find something much more personal and also universal at the same time. I loved reading it. I learned a lot about the science of fish, which is something that I did not think I would be learning. And I ended up learning a lot about what it means to tell a story and how to think about stories. So, highly recommended.
I'll say Novasim from James Lovelock, who was the scientist who invented the concept Gaia. So actually, this book was written in his 99. So he created a kind of concept Novacine just right after Anthropocene. So it's pretty science fiction. I wouldn't give out too many spoiler, but definitely need to check it out because it's highly relevant to all these major issues we're discussing right now, like climate change, like technology and humanity, like what's the next step of our civilization, etc., etc.
That's great. Thank you both so much for this compassionate and wide-ranging conversation that went from Greek epic poems to demystifying algorithms to what does it mean to be human, and I think far beyond our initial range of topics, but I couldn't expect anything less. So thank you both, Ken and Stan, for joining us today on AntKast.
Thank you so much. Thank you for
Thank you very
us.
much.
Thanks.